All right. Hello, everybody. Apologies for the slight delay. I'm glad that we all made our way up here. And welcome also to the folks online to this panel debate on economic security cooperation in Canada-U.S. relations, moving from tension to teamwork. It's my great pleasure to welcome you at the University of Ottawa. Bienvenue à tous et à toutes. The University of Ottawa is located on unceded Algonquin territory, and we pay tribute to elders past and present. Let me briefly introduce our moderator and then quickly our panelist. So this event is co-organized with Professor Patrick Leblanc, who is going to moderate today's discussion. And we're also delighted to be partnering with the Atlantic Council Geoeconomic Center. And we have Kim Donovan here on the panel from the Geoeconomic Center of the Atlantic Council. Can everyone hear me online? There's a bit of a backfeed. Okay, perfect. Then to Kim's left, we have Jeffrey Gertz, who is a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. And next to...
It looks like it's just starting.
Sorry? Okay. It is good if everybody online could be muted. And again, apologies for the slight delay. We have Jeff Mohan, who is joining us next to Jeffrey Gertz here. He is director at the Strategy Corp and responsible for geopolitical advice. And finally, we have Daniel Goldfarb, who is a global fellow at the Wilson Center. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here, and I'll pass the floor to my colleague, Patrick Leblanc. And I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Wolfgang Arschner, and I'm the Hyman Soloway Chair in Business and Trade Law at the University of Ottawa's Law Faculty. So this is an event that's co-sponsored by the Public Policy School and the Law Faculty. And the Telfer School of Management, who have generously provided this room. So, Patrick, you have the floor.
All right. Thank you very much, gang. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for people being online. Thank you for your patience as we kind of sorted out the elevator problem. Yeah. So we're here to talk about economic security and cooperation between Canada and the United States. We all know what has been happening in the last few days. Apparently, we just won an extra month before something else happens. So something to look forward to. We'll have to see if this happens every month now. This panel couldn't be timelier, obviously, given everything that's happened and what's going to be happening. Yes, a lot of the focus is on tariffs these days in the media, but we want to discuss more broadly when it comes to economic security, what that is, what it means from a Canadian perspective, from a U.S. perspective. So I think that's where we're going to start. There are some confusion about what it is. In some cases, people say, well, economic security is national security. Other people say it's different. So we have a great lineup of panelists to discuss these issues and look how, in a way, we can move from tensions to teamwork. May not seem like it's possible right now, but our panelists hopefully will provide us with some optimism. We hope so. So I'm going to start with Kim on my left. Kim, what is economic security? What does it mean, and what does it mean for the U.S.?
Okay, well, first of all, Patrick, thank you so much for having me, and to Wolfgang for hosting us. Economic security, from my perspective, it's a pretty evolving field. There's been a significant emphasis on protecting and securing economic resiliency within various states. I think this really is in reaction to what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that had on different critical supply chains around the world. So there's been this increased push, through the Trump administration as well as the Biden administration in the United States to ensure that our economy is secure. I think it also is very important to note that this economic security is national security. That is specific language in a quote from Trump's first term, the 2017 National Security Strategy. So on the U.S. side, I think there is more of a national security approach to economic security in general. And these are themes that continued during the Biden administration, such as with the CHIPS Act, where we were trying to bring back investment in manufacturing in the United States as an attempt to kind of pull away from China a bit. And I don't like the word de-risk, but to de-risk a bit from China, especially when we're looking at technology and sophisticated technology and chips. But yeah, it's a constantly evolving field. I think that there's been a lot of progress between the U.S. and Canada over recent years on the economic security front. We'll see where things go from here in light of recent events over the past couple of days, but historically there's been a very strong relationship between our countries that hopefully we can continue to work towards common objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have shared interests.
A lot.
Jeffrey, what are the main issues, again, from a U.S. perspective, when we talk about the economic security? I mean, obviously, Kim mentioned some of them, referring to the CHIPS Act. So what are, there's a Trump administration that has its own issues. We're still kind of trying to figure out what those are exactly, certainly from this side of the border. But generally, what are, notwithstanding which administration is in power, what are the real kind of economic security issues that the U.S. is having or has to deal with? Maybe it has dealt with or not. And then, obviously that's going to help more from a Canadian perspective, what does it mean for us afterwards? And we'll get to that after. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Thanks to Wolfgang for organizing this event. Very happy to be here. Look, I think it's a hard day for anybody to stand on stage and kind of confidently tell you what the United States wants on policy here, as we are sort of, looking at sort of tweet by tweet how kind of U.S. policy is changing on these areas. But kind of looking past a little bit the sort of day-to-day kind of tariff threats and everything else, I do think, as sort of Kim was also saying, there is elements of a kind of shared bipartisan push on economic security, which I think you can actually trace back really to sort of end of the Biden administration through kind of the first Trump administration, end of the Obama administration through the first Trump administration, through the Biden, and kind of into Trump 2 now. And I think there's kind of three big buckets of policies we can look at, or maybe kind of concerns. So one is on a sort of supply chain security and resilience issues. And again, I think a lot of this comes out of COVID-19 sort of supply chain shocks there, as well tied to a lot of the sort of, Russia-Ukraine kind of shocks to energy markets there. So I think there's a kind of set of issues around, moving away from a very hands-off approach to supply chains and actually saying we need to do more about mapping critical supply chains, have more active kind of industrial policy engagement to shape those supply chains to better understand where vulnerabilities are. This, I think, frankly, is an area where there's been a lot of talk. There's been a little bit of action, but I am not sure there's been enough done yet to truly understand where are the vulnerabilities in supply chains. And again, to be blunt, I think things like overnight implementation of a 25% tariff are going to reveal a lot of kind of vulnerabilities in those supply chains that we probably have not kind of fully identified where those risks are not yet. So we can kind of come back to that maybe. And then two other kind of maybe more, true national security focused areas. One is the idea and kind of the real risks of kind of foreign adversaries, particularly using U.S. developed technologies and technologies developed by U.S. partners and allies to advance their own kind of military capabilities. And so certainly if you look at the big suite of export controls, particularly on advanced semiconductors that the Biden administration team unveiled, as well as things like the outbound investment order, and certainly going back to a lot of these sort of inbound investments, sort of screening under CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. there is this kind of throughput of, what I, to be clear, do think is a genuine risk. Again, it's particularly of China, but also of other adversary nations, using U.S. developed technologies in ways that harm U.S. national security and the sort of national security and stability of our partners and allies. So again, that's an area where I expect we'll continue to see more policy development, where I think the kind of Biden team did a lot to develop that toolkit, and I expect there will be a fair bit of continuity on those issues in second Trump administration. And then the second area where, again, there's sort of been some policy development, but possibly more needs to be done, are kind of the more, domestic national security risks of how integration with, again, particularly in the kind of technology sector, risks to deep integration with adversary nations. And so again, here, we can look back specifically, I think, to the 2019 executive order on the Information Communication Technology Supply Chain, the ICTS executive order, which created kind of quite broad authorities for the US government to look at risks emanating from, again, sort of 6 adversary nations with a real focus particularly on China, and the threats both of access to data and kind of control over sort of connected products. And what we've seen here, we've seen the first big motion has been on connected vehicles, but I think connected vehicles is really only the first of many potential new actions. We already seen the kind of announcement of looking at drones as being a second area, but I think frankly, there's tons of different products that, this executive order creates the authority to say, is it a risk to have, data flowing back to China? I mean, just sort of any room you're in, you can look around, there's, dozens of goods in this room that have kind of parts in them from China that potentially are creating vulnerabilities of data going to China, of China having remote access to various capabilities. That kind of more domestic national security risk, again, is an area where I think we are sort of starting to see movement, but where I expect there to be more. And then just sort of wrapping up briefly, I think on the question of sort of what does the United States, what does it mean for Canada, kind of what is the United States asking of its partners? I think the Biden team in particular did a lot of sort of building out the sort of toolkit here on economic security, and was starting to do a push really through sort of diplomatic lobbying to get like-minded partners and allies to implement their sort of similar approaches. And again, this kind of goes back to Trump 1, and I expect will be kind of picked up in Trump 2 as well. Really looking to partners and allies to kind of follow on what the United States is doing. And I will just give a brief plug along with my colleague Emily Kilcrease at the Center for New American Security. We've been doing work around sort of economic security agreements and how can you start to build in some of these authorities into traditional trade agreements. And I do think there's a real agenda to be had here and looking forward to kind of, reviewing / renegotiating USMCA. I know we've been sort of debating that nomenclature, but I suspect there will be a push to pull in a lot of these new authorities into trade agreements like USMCA.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeffrey. Jeff, now let's move to the Canadian side. We have a sense of what the Americans want, or at least what's of concern to them. What is economic security for us? What does that mean?
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks everybody for being with us today. Yeah, so economic security, the official Canadian view is TBD, because we're still waiting for the consultations that finished last fall, but the result from those, an announcement on the Canadian government's economic security policy is forthcoming, and I think people are waiting for that. But that doesn't mean that Canada doesn't have a grasp on what economic security is. And for those, I'm sure a lot of the people who've logged on today have been following the debates over the years, but we've got a broad swath of people online and in the room. So maybe you've only really been hearing about economic security in the last year or so. But the reality is that economic security issues have been occupying Canadian policymakers for a long time. And I would say that the rise of this economic security regime, which is taking place, is inversely proportional to the decline of the rules-based international order. And what do I mean by that is that economic security issues have really emerged because of some tensions with the current system, like the current rules, the open WTO system that the U.S. is, largely anchors, and it's the rise of China. and with non-market economic practices and other issues that have made that system a bit more fragile. And because economic power, which China's really, amassed, has become like the world's largest exporter and the second largest economy, flows into political power or military power. And that's also brought with it a rise of concerns about dual-use technologies and other things. So with this shifting balance of power, it shakes the foundations of the rules, and all of a sudden it rises a set of new circumstances or situations which the old rules have proven to be difficult to deal with. And I think while we're talking about it a lot now, as Kim and Jeffrey just pointed out, that this has been taking, the policy response has been taking place for a while. And on the Canadian side, we already actually have a lot of suite of tools to deal with this. And I guess before I outline them, I'll say, when I think about economic security, I kind of envision two different buckets, although they may overlap. And so one of those is economic-based threats to national security. And so that could be dual-use technologies. So we deal with that through, say, export controls. And we have an international treaty and rules-based process for dealing with that, the Wassenaar Agreement. Another example of economic-based threats to national security would be if a foreign entity were to seek to take over a company or make some kind of investment in an area that could be military or some other form of sensitivities to national security. We've got the Investment Canada Act to deal with that under its national security review process. We've also, the government, when I say we, I'm using the big collective we because I'm no longer with the Canadian government, but the government has introduced policies to deal with research security. So guidelines that affect research institutions from and their particular projects from accessing federal government. They have to align with certain parameters put out. They have to do due diligence to ensure that they're not getting into projects in sensitive dual-use areas that could ultimately lead to undermining Canadian national security. So there's that angle. But another really important angle that makes up economic security, and I think it's going to become even more and more prevalent, is the notion of long-term economic competitiveness. And this element was reflected also in the Trump 2017 national security strategy, but you also see this language in the fall economic statement that Canada released late last fall, and by last fall I mean in December when that came out, and it talks about this notion that there is this competition for investment and the productive capital and jobs that it produces, and that is a key element of economic security, because what we have discovered, and this is why the non-market practices are so important, is that in a global market economy where some really strong actors may not necessarily play by the rules, it can alter the structure of the market and then the outcomes it produces. And that has been shifting the distribution of gains from economic competition. And because economic power and political power and military power are all intertwined, that becomes something very, very difficult, but not just from the national security concerns, but also from a political stability lens. Because as we've seen, when there's not a plethora of good paying jobs, you have challenges at the domestic level, whether that is also indeed the fentanyl crisis in some ways has elements related to that long-term economic aspect of economic security. I would also argue other ways, but we could maybe get into that a little bit later. But all that goes to say is the Canadian government does have policies in place. It is trying to deal with this. It is a new emerging challenge because not everything I've rattled off here affects things. We had discussions earlier today, and we were talking about cyber threats that companies might face, or various due diligence or other aspects. So there's a shifting playing field for companies, and they're starting to find that in some cases they could be used as pawns in geopolitical or geoeconomic competition, and that further complicates matter. But we'll unpack some more later. I'll leave it there for now, Patrick.
It's interesting you mentioned, kind of not playing by the rules and how can that has kind of shifted everything. And you mentioned China, but I guess nowadays we could talk about the United States not playing by the rules and kind of shifting and affecting economic competitiveness. But I'm sure we'll come back to that. Danielle, in addition to the issues that Jeff raised from a Canadian perspective, what are things that, relate to our economic security here in Canada, but that maybe kind of fall under the radar or not out there but are equally important and that we should focus on?
First of all, thank you for having us here. I would like to just maybe add an angle to what Jeff talked about first, and then I'll talk about some things that are under the radar. I think that what we're all feeling in this room at this moment after the events of the last couple days is a slightly different angle on economic security than maybe what you outlined, and which is really that about, we are a small open economy. We are reliant on trade to maintain and advance our living standards. And we're talking about really our prosperity and making sure that we are resilient to challenges to that prosperity. And I think that that's what we've been kind of facing over the last 72 hours plus a number of weeks before that. And I think that is really challenging a lot of the assumptions that we had about our economic security and where it's derived from. So for example, I think we had this assumption that our economic security was enhanced by this integration, the deep integration we had in many of our economic sectors, manufacturing sectors, with cross border, with goods going back and forth across the border, we're making things together. We thought that was a source of strength and resilience and economic security. That assumption has been challenged with, to say the least. And I think the same thing that, in terms of access to interdependent energy markets, access, knowing that Canada has, is the U.S.'s largest supplier of critical minerals. So I think that these are things that we thought were sources of resilience, strength, economic security, kind of keeping us making us less vulnerable, and sort of some of these assumptions. I mean, some of them may still be true. Maybe there's still, that there's still this assumption that, I guess we'll see what happens in the next 30 days, and on all of those issues. But I think that is, as a small open economy with one next door neighbor and oceans all around us, and the geography that we've been, happens to be the world's largest economy, most dynamic economy. Economic security is really about how do we maintain our prosperity in the situation we're in. But I also, to your point, Patrick, about what's sort of under the radar, I think that, when we talk about, I think, a lot of the discussion over the last 72 hours in particular, but a lot of the discussion tends to focus on our natural resource strength, our manufacturer strength. But we are actually a services-based economy that's not getting nearly as much attention. Maybe that's okay. That's good news that it's maybe a little bit under the radar screen. But that is actually our fastest growing area of trade. That is an area where there's a lot of strength, in particular if you look at technology services, a lot of different kinds of services that are traded back and forth between Canada and the United States, and that can be a real source of economic security and resilience, and I think are really the fastest growing, most promising areas of growth when we think about economic security. And then I also think that we're in the midst of a major technological advance and change, and this is something, again, kind of maybe getting a little less attention, but we are, I think, how Canada positions itself. We've had major advances in terms of general purpose artificial intelligence that, in the last make any number of things possible that were not possible even a year or two ago. In some cases, even a couple of weeks ago, there have been new advances. And I think we need to think about economic security in that context. So how is it that we are going to position how does Canada position itself to take advantage and be resilient in the face of that opportunity, to adopt the right technologies, to cooperate where it makes sense to cooperate, and to make sure that it's positioned to be resilient and prosperous in the face of these major changes from a technological standpoint.
Thank you very much, Danielle. It's interesting that both Danielle and Jeffrey mentioned this idea of kind of the end of deep integration and the assumptions around that, right? Jeffrey, you mentioned that in saying, you know, among the three elements that you mentioned in terms of the issues is the dangers of too much integration, and obviously you referred to adversary nations. And the same with Danielle, who talked about, you know, kind of our assumption of deep integration in North America with the United States is, you know, is no longer a source of strength and resilience. In fact, it's a vulnerability, and we've just seen it happen. So, and going back to this idea of rules of the game, and that, you know, not only are the rules of the game changing, but, you know, countries' willingness to abide by those rules have changed. So how do we deal with this? You know, so we're in a new environment. You know, there was a mention, I forget if it was Kim or Jeffrey, about, you know, the Biden administration kind of wanting to reach out to allies in terms of the CHIPS Act and you know, assuming Canada was going to be part, and Canada did actually follow some measures that basically mirrored what the U.S. was doing. But does that mean that we're in a situation where kind of now everything is transactional? That it's all about, okay, if we had shared interests, we can make a deal. You know, what's good? I have something that's good for me. You have something. I can do something that's good for you, and that's it. But no long-term thinking going forward, where, you know, kind of the same way that, yes, you know, the U.S. wants to do business with China, but now maybe Canada and the U.S. are also in a but situation. Yes, but. So I'd like to hear your views on that. Like, is this a long-term, in a way, structural change that's happening? Obviously, even within countries like Canada and the U.S., which have been the closest of allies for so long. And in a way, what does that mean also maybe for the rest of the world when it comes to Canada dealing with other countries, but the U.S. also? So maybe if, you know, I know it wasn't on my notes, but I'm throwing this at you.
Easy
so I don't know
question.
who wants to go first.
I'm happy to give a few quick thoughts on it. So maybe the starting point, I think, is something that Jeff mentioned as well, which is that I do think I agree with the criticism of some in the United States that say the kind of old system was actually not working very well. The kind of the old WTO rules of the game, as it were, had many flaws. And I think you don't need to sort of sign on to all of the Trump critiques of sort of foreign economic policy to accept that kind of the economic architecture as it exists, built kind of through the decades of the sort of 80s, 90s, 2000s, was increasingly outdated and was sort of ill-suited to address the conflation of economic security issues, where we are sort of seeing, you know, national security kind of coming into these kind of core international economic issues, where again, the kind of old WTO world basically kind of relegates that to a national security exception and sort of saying, you know, we've got a general rules of the game for kind of economic flows, and then national security issues are sort of off to the side and we're not really going to talk about them. I think that's sort of no longer tenable as a system for organizing the global economy. And so we've moved away from that, and I think you are absolutely right that there is a kind of increasing focus on transactionalism, and certainly the sort of Trump team, I think, kind of leans into a lot of that transactionalism. I do think it's a kind of open question of, you know, where should we be going? Sort of like, what's the sort of the third option beyond the kind of an old sort of WTO-based system of let's treat all countries the same and let's kind of ignore national security versus a kind of pure transactionalism, kind of short-termism. I think, you know, something the Biden team started to work towards, but probably didn't get as far as they should have. And something that I would sort of like to see the Trump team do more is to like put out a kind of official economic security strategy. I think you were saying that kind of one from Canada is coming. We don't know yet if one from the United States will be coming, but I think it would be extremely helpful to have the Trump team kind of lay out, here's where we think the world economy should be going over the next, several decades. And again, that's not going back to a sort of pure WTO rules-based order, but I think there is a world to sort of say, this is what we think the sort of long-term architecture should look like, in which the sort of transactionalism fits in there, but there is also kind of more long-term strategic thinking. But whether or not that's where kind of this administration is going to go, I don't know.
So maybe some kind of hybrid. Kim, what do you say?
Thank you, Patrick. No, I mean, I agree with Jeffrey. I think that, and I hate to say we're in a let's wait and see. We've been articulating the need for some level of economic security strategy for a while. Even, we were talking a lot about economic security, but I think a component of this we tried to describe as economic statecraft, which is all of the economic levers that we use to advance different national security. So more like the sanctions, export controls versus tariffs of what's being discussed now. But they agree. I mean, we need some kind of better understanding of what is the strategic goal that we're trying to achieve so that we can kind of figure out if it is a transactional, like we'll do this, you do this, and we go from there versus a long-term strategy of how are we going to do this together. There's a lot of dependencies, I think, between Canada and the United States. Like I know it's not just Canada that will be facing a lot of struggles with the potential tariffs, even with the pause for 30 days. And so I think we're going to have to work together to figure out what does this look like in the long run. So yeah, I think that we're somewhere stuck between transactionalism, which that's a good word, and a long-term strategy at this point.
Daniel, Jeff, how do we, if we are in this world where the old rules are being challenged, are not being respected, there's lots of pressures for more short-term transactional approaches. What does that mean? I mean, Danielle already talked about that, Jeff too, right? We're a small open economy. We are, highly integrated with the United States, which makes us vulnerable. At the same time, it has provided us with incredible benefits. So how do we deal with this? What's the response? Do we decide that, there's been talk about, more free trade in Canada, but is that really enough? And can we really say, can we be transactional with the U.S.? It's not as if the U.S. is going to go away, even if we're pissed off at them because they the U.S. government imposed 25. Well, now they pushed them back, but just the fact that they were going to do it, So what does that mean for Canada? Looking forward, in that if we're looking at maybe we're going to towards some kind of hybrid. So, short-term transactions. What do we do? Longer term, what's the plan? What's the strategy that we should be adopting for this kind of very unstable world? So I don't know, Danielle?
Easy question. Sure, I have the answer.
I'm just channeling what the audience is thinking, right?
I mean, it's obviously this is, again, small open economy, rules-based. We benefit from that kind of world. This is, at face value, bad news for Canada. I think that, we've for a long time have resisted this sort of shift towards including security, the broader security concept in kind of, our economic policy and trade policy but I guess we have some examples that, one example that comes to mind is 9/11 and what would happen at the border at that moment, and during the time after that, where again, like on the Canadian side, like we didn't want to be dealing with border security and all of those issues, but again, it's sort of existential crisis at that moment, and we figured out how to make our some of these security matters align with our economic interests and work together to propose a series of activities along the border that would improve things. I don't know if we can do exactly the same thing in this moment, but one idea would be thinking about, again, sort of the technological moment that we're in and what's possible at the border, just even in terms of some of these advances we've seen in terms of general purpose artificial intelligence, where we can do seamless translation, we can do all kinds of e-logistics and e-customs and so on, and we can do a lot of work, to your point, Jeff, about the kind of secure supply chain, and we can do a lot more work to map out what is legitimate traffic and what is illegal and work stuff we don't want to see, and Canada can be part of the solution. We have a lot of expertise when it comes to artificial intelligence. We have a lot of expertise, and we have an interest, an economic interest in this as well, and that aligns in an area that you've mentioned is important. So I'm thinking that there's these discrete areas where we're going to have to be very, we're going to have to look for where we can align those security interests with economic interests, and then I think we're going to have to think of broader strategies of how do we. We now have a situation where, like, we thought we had a reliable partner on trade, and many of our other partners were sort of unreliable, but now increasingly the U.S. is, maybe an unreliable partner, and we have to think about what does that mean for our broader strategy? What does that mean for diversification for Canada? And, those are some bigger questions.
Jeff?
It's a big question, and first, I guess the one thing we need to recognize too is it's not like all the rules have just been ripped up and thrown into the trash can. And the other thing too is, even to the extent that the rules may start to get a little blurry at this point, there's still a lot of norms, and for a lot of businesses, maybe not those 77% of Canadian exports that are heading into the United States in 2023, when that number comes from. They can still rely on, just most trade is going to go and take place as business as usual internationally. It's now when these more geopolitical elements start entering into the fold where the rules start to get messing around. And it's, I think, really key too is particularly when we talk about that long-term economic competitiveness aspect and that fight for jobs and productive investment, that might be an area where when a big economy starts to look at following the rules or seeing its particular interests at stake, it might bend it. And so I can't remember how someone phrased it a few moments ago, but the way I look at it is like we're at risk of devolving into this law of the jungle. And I remember years ago, the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, said something to the effect of, there are big countries and there are small countries, and small countries must suffer what they must. And unfortunately, with the recent actions from the United States, it seems to apply from them in a really aggressive way right now. And so in terms of the path forward, Canada's is facing a really difficult situation, because we are a trading nation, yet 77% of our exports are tied to the United States. And we have an infrastructure deficit, a trade-enabling infrastructure deficit that prevents us from being able to quickly pivot and move a lot of our products. And that's given us a lack of options. And that really forced us into a tough situation when the United States came down with the hammer. And that was economic coercion, and that gets into that whole notion of not just long-term economic competitiveness, which is clearly threatened, but it's also a national security issue, because when Donald Trump talked about using economic force to cause problems for Canada, that's a really critical situation, because we're finding where now trade tools can come in to hammer us for completely unrelated aspects. Now, to be perfectly honest, I don't think there's too many people in the room that could argue that the policy alignment that the administration is seeking from Canada on stronger borders and fighting organized crime in fentanyl is a bad or not the kind of policy direction Canada wants to take. But it was the means to get us there that was just so crass from that perspective. So I think Canada the way forward is, of course, we need to really ask some tough questions about being honest with ourselves about what kind of world it is we're living in now. And that's going to cause us to, or should force us to make some decisions that were politically difficult over the last decade about getting that trade enabling infrastructure and to enable us to be able to have more export capacity and to be able to winnow some of that reliance of the United States away. We're never going to not want to have that big market. It's helped lead to Canadian economic development. It has been a boon, but it's also been at some costs, and those costs are looking to increase. And so I would say that it's going to be a really tough situation for Canada, and we can probably talk a little bit more about that later, but maybe I'll pass it back to you, Patrick, for some more questions.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I mean, the idea of Canadian vulnerability in terms of our dependence, our economic dependence with the United States is nothing new, right? We've been talking about this since the 1970s when under the Trudeau government, there was this idea of the third option of trying to look for other markets, and it's just been ongoing, except that, you know, things have been easy, relatively easy, and especially since the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States in the late 1980s. And you know, so yes, we knew there was an issue there, that we were vulnerable, but as long as we were, you know, making money and finding ways around some of the challenges, including after 9/11, you know, we just kept going and you know, obviously developing markets on the Asian side, on the European side, or Latin America or Africa, you know, that's a lot more work than if you're just, you know, drive down south or get on a plane and a few hours later you can meet with your suppliers or your customers or your clients, speak the same language, watch the same shows, listen to the same music. So, you know, but you're right, it is kind of bringing it now. It's like, oh, wow, this vulnerability is actually real. It can happen. So I think in that sense, it sounds like it's a wake-up call. But now I'd like to ask all four of you, in spite of all that and the uncertainty around it, you know, Canada and the U.S. are stuck with each other, whether they want it or not. So what are some areas, and some you've kind of touched upon these things, but maybe can you highlight some areas where Canada and the U.S. in the current, I mean, we know there's a lot of uncertainty, they're still not clear exactly, but there are some issues out there where clearly there are shared interests. So if maybe you want to speak a bit about those shared interests in terms of, you know, how can Canada help the U.S. with its economic security? Is there things that the U.S. can do? But let's say right now we're maybe more in terms of what we can do for the U.S. Or where can we cooperate? You know, the theme of this session is, you know, from tension to teamwork. So what kind of teamwork could work in spite of the current tensions? Where should we be looking at maybe to kind of stabilize things and kind of maybe start rebuilding a bit of the foundations that have been, let's say, hit a bit hard in the last few days. So maybe Kim, want to start?
So even before I jump into that, I do think, because I do want to drive home this point that, I mean, Jeffrey made on this economic security strategy. I think that the United States is the largest economy in the world. Our currency, the dollar, is the primary reserve currency for the world. It's a huge responsibility. And I think that with that responsibility, we owe it to all of our partners to be very clear on how we are going to use and leverage our tools and for what purposes, so that not only governments can react and be positioned to you know, protect their own economies or figure out where can they work better with the U.S., but also so that markets have the opportunity to react as well and watch out for their own equities. So just, I want to foot stomp that. But in terms of where Canada and the U.S. can continue to work, I mean, at least with this recent executive order with the tariffs, clearly one of our major economic security concerns is the border and the transnational organized crime and illicit finance and fentanyl and drug trafficking. And so, you know, there are several different working groups already between the United States and Canada that have been created to address these issues. Hopefully, with the conversation that the Prime Minister and President had earlier this afternoon, it sounds like Canada is going to be taking some steps forward to kind of maybe enhance some of the existing things. So that's good. I think there's also, again, going back to these vulnerabilities, dependencies, energy and critical minerals are huge. The United States imports a significant amount of crude oil from Canada, and we're exporting our own oil. So this system has been created and established over several years. It's not something easy to just break. So we're going to have to figure out how we can continue to make advancements maybe in the energy and oil pipelines, as well as on the critical mineral supply chains. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there and mutual interest to work together on those issues.
Okay, thank you. Jeffrey?
I think Kim partially stole mine on energy, critical minerals, so it's sort of, double tap on that. A couple of things. I do think kind of on autos, right, that like the sort of integration of the auto supply chain in North America is really at sort of the heart of USMCA. I can say from my own kind of personal sort of discussions with folks, I'm not sure anybody has more at stake in the continuation of USMCA than the big car companies who have like done a lot to integrate their supply chains between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. So I do think that's an area where there's so much at stake that there's going to be a real push to continue cooperation. And so I do suspect that will be a kind of stabilizing force, as it were. A couple other quick thoughts. I do think on sort of Arctic security is an area where there's going to be a lot of shared interest and a lot of kind of increasing focus from both governments going forward. So I suspect to see more kind of areas of cooperation there. And then, maybe an area where I do think the United States has a lot to learn from Canada is on the research security front, which I think Jeff mentioned briefly, and maybe we'll say more on. But I think that's an area where actually Canada is really a global leader in putting in, a lot of the hard work and hard thinking to what is a genuinely very hard question, which is how do you maintain the kind of openness, which is so critical for having sort of world-leading universities and kind of pushing forward the research frontier, while addressing the very real national security concerns about kind of, national security relevant knowledge and technologies that are developed in those universities, them being kind of transferred to adversary nations. So I think that is an area where it'd be great to see more cooperation on.
Okay, great, thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, well, of course, critical minerals is absolutely key, and Canada has a variety of minerals that are really important to U.S. national security, and also again to that notion of long-term economic competitiveness. So I won't beat the horse there because I think everybody truly understands that. And the reality is, our trade is so high because we offer each other so much, because there is that great complementary aspect. Are there going to be various instances where some policies on either side of the border create some problems for each other? That happened with Trump administration last time around, the steel and aluminum. Canada was upset with how that was handled, but it was also dealing with some transshipment risks again involving China and other things. Tariffs, unfortunately caused a lot of pain, but that was a tool to get Canada's attention. I think to get more cooperation out of Canada, and there's a lot of room, particularly to deal with those sectors where we are so integrated, is to advance things further with regulatory cooperation. But to get there, we're going to need to rebuild some trust again. And I keep going back to this notion of long-term competitiveness and investment for jobs. And because there's a lot of people, a lot of Canadians right now who are concerned that what Trump is trying to do is weaponize uncertainty. And that by holding this threat of tariffs over Canada, he wants to scare investment decisions to be to not come into Canada, but to move into the United States, so those jobs move there. And if there's one thing that's going to impact investment decisions, market access is going to be critical to that. Canada's own FDI attraction strategies often will have on its PowerPoint presentations our great access to the United States, which is supported by a number of other competitive advantages. But our small market means that preferential access there is just a critical value proposition to get more investment. And what's worse is it's not just foreign investors that this could scare off, but even Canadian companies that rely on the U.S. market may to protect their business move across the border, and that's the real big threat. But another thing that I note that was in the debates over the past few days about these concerns that are really undermining trust is, what are the real motivations? Now personally, my view is that we needed to take President Trump at his word. Yes, there was some tweets now and again that went all over the place and did some shock and awe. And unfortunately, we really grabbed onto the worst of them all, which was that 51st state aspect. But I think the Prime Minister did the right thing today in terms of focusing on the fentanyl and coming up with a border solution to deal with the United States, because we needed to address that issue with alacrity. I think we should have been less deflective on that in the weeks leading up to this. If the perception in the U.S. is there's a problem, we should have, and they're threatening such a heavy tool, we should have been a lot more serious about that problem instead of trying to convince them there was no problem or that just how valuable the relationship is. But not everyone shares that view, that's what's there. And another big angle I've heard from a lot of really smart people is that there might be this aspect related to this 51st state, and that economic force is being something to drive us down. And indeed, probably my biggest fear in all of this is that there is some deep down glory impulse in President Trump, where his political ambition harks back to ancient Rome, and the path to immortality for him runs through manifest destiny. That is a real concern that I think a lot of people had. It was all over the news the past few days. So, but we shouldn't be giving, that's a shocker, eh? But we shouldn't be giving in to that right now. We need to be focusing on the issue at hand, getting past that. But if this keeps coming back, if it just 1 month turns into another month, it may not cause the economic harm in terms of the immediate shock, but it'll have a long-term harm on Canada because of the scare on investment.
Okay. Thank you for this, Jeff. I have a few follow-up questions, but first I'd like to hear Danielle.
Oh, well, I'm obviously very concerned about the impact on investment too. I think that's a huge, is this on? It's a huge risk for Canada. I know I'm the fourth person to mention the critical minerals, but I just want to add the point that there was actually a really good report that came out from the Center for Strategic International Studies Critical Minerals Center this week, last week actually. It's been a long week, hard to remember. It's a lot has happened. It's only Monday, but it seems like a lot has happened. And in that report, it talks about how tariffs on Canadian critical minerals basically increase reliance on critical minerals from China, and how that sort of runs counter to the U.S. national interest and objectives to reduce reliance on critical minerals from China. Anyhow, we always think it's carries more weight if it comes out of Washington. So just to emphasize how important that the critical minerals are for an area that I think there is a lot of potential to work together and to presumably get through this period. Another area when we just think about the sort of the AI economy and data centers when it comes to energy, and Canada having a cold climate, being a peaceful, stable, democratic nation, that's another area that I think there can be cooperation and collaboration. We already talked a bit about how we can work together to sort of map the border for vulnerabilities, and that's something we can do to kind of reduce the friction in our trade and perhaps counteract some of the uncertainty and the problems that have been caused by the recent announcements. And then, Jeff, something that you talked about in your work earlier today was this idea of common a common kind of data zone where we have data flows, again, sort of, for services, for AI, where we have kind of data flows that are, kind of in this common zone between trusted partners. I think we have to think more. I mean, I don't know if we thought through all the implications of all of this, but I think these are the kinds of things that we now have to, from the Canadian point of view, we now have to start to look at, where, if we want to be part of these more digital AI type economies, and we have a lot of expertise here in Canada, we have a lot of talent here in Canada working on a lot of these questions. So to what degree do we want to sort of look at some of these things that are a little more difficult to see and smell and touch, but that could be really important for our shared economic security. And then last, on the sort of the question of the Arctic, which you also mentioned was another area. Again, Canada has a lot of more remote and less populated regions. The technological advances that have now been made that allow us to surveil and that allow us to understand what's happening in these regions is an area that Canada has some expertise in, and which we can sort of deploy some of those tools and expertise and talent to help address and move forward in some of these areas, particularly as the climate changes. So those are just a few ideas that I think we should be thinking about.
Great. Thank you very much, Danielle. Just a quick comments before we turn to the audience for questions. Well, one issue, and this is not something that you need to answer, but I think one issue on the Canadian side is, talking about critical minerals, is getting them out of the ground, right? This is a huge challenge. I mean, Jeff talked about, infrastructure, but that's part of it, but it's also kind of, we know that we have them, but one of the big issues is actually building the mines and getting companies to actually take them out. It seems that, we talk about all this opportunity, but it's not clear that the business community, at least so far, really has seen this opportunity. So we really have to think about what's the problem here, what's the issue, and how government and businesses, either within Canada or both across the border, need to think about this. The other, when Jeff, you talked about kind of Trump weaponizing uncertainty to move jobs to the U.S., it kind of made me think, well, who's going to fill out those jobs in the U.S.? I mean, unemployment rate is already low. There's going to be, at least from this administration, deportation and kind of stopping the flow of immigrants. So, I mean, it's great to move all these this investment, or at least wanting to move these jobs and investments, but do they actually exist? Are the people in the U.S. going to be there for those jobs? So again, just a question I'm throwing out there. Don't necessarily need to answer right now. And yes, on Manifest Destiny, maybe it's not a bad idea that we reinforce our border. All right. Do we have a mic for the audience, or maybe we should take that one, Wolfgang? Take questions. Maybe if you want to raise your hand, and Wolfgang can do the distribution. Any questions? Wow, you answered everything. That's amazing. I can't believe there are no questions. Questions? You have a question, please.
Yes, this critical minerals. And one of the panelists saying that we should not ignore all of the fanciful words of Mr. Trump. He talked about invading Greenland, and there's a lot of critical mineral there just for the grabbing. Don't have to, seemingly would be an easier route to continue the shock and awe.
Okay, well, maybe Canada should take over Greenland and protect its own critical minerals. I guess, yeah, I mean, we're not the only ones producing critical minerals, but we are the closest ones. Anyone want to add anything to this, or should we take a few more questions?
Well, maybe I'll just quickly go over one of the questions you asked earlier about getting the mines up and running and the critical minerals out of the ground and processed value add here in Canada to be able to enter into Canadian and continental supply chains. So at the end of the day, it comes back down to this notion of investment. And a key thing to investment is you need to have the space for investment, and that includes a regulatory framework. And the reality is, in Canada, we have been scaring away, or at least creating our own uncertainty in investment. And part of that is through, say, impact assessment legislation that was introduced under this government. And that has not added to the confidence that investors need to be able to bring these hugely capital-intensive projects to market. So I think Canada needs to think about not just for critical minerals. So we need, there's a number of different specific things that could be done there to make it easier for, startup, or I shouldn't say startup, but those junior mining companies that have, reached certain sets of criteria in terms of project development, and they're in what's called the valley of death, where it becomes really difficult to bridge from that post-feasibility stage to actual investment. So if we had loan guarantees and other things that the government can do, which don't necessarily mean using taxpayer dollars to help get these into market, I think that would be something really helpful. And just the overall regulatory environment. We talk a lot about internal trade barriers. Okay, yeah, there's some there. I used to negotiate for the government of Nunavut at the CFTA, but there's also federally regulated industries. And there's also other things here that are preventing things. So I think that Canada needs to be able to make sure that it has a competitive business environment that gives regulatory certainty to investors to make Canada an attractive place to invest and bring those jobs here, whether it's in critical minerals or other sectors.
Anyone else wants to add something? Jeffrey?
Yes, briefly on the kind of getting mining projects going. So, certainly not a mining expert, won't pretend to be, but I do think there's a piece of this that is tied to sort of, in addition to everything that Jeff said, a real kind of financing question, sort of general, that sort of mining often has these issues of sort of, mineral prices that are fluctuating up and down very quickly, making it difficult to make sort of decades-long, decisions on investments or not. And I do think there's actually been some interesting thinking going on sort of, what financial instruments are needed to kind of provide more long-term kind of price guidance here. And I think, again, the United States may not have that many critical minerals, but I think does have a comparative advantage in complex financial instruments. And there may actually be kind of ways to bring in sort of U.S. financing tools there that provide sort of opportunities for cooperation. That'd be helpful.
Well, that certainly, if we can match our expertise, that certainly would be great. Danielle, Kim, anything you would like to add at this point? Okay, well, let's see. Other questions? Well, please ask a question.
What about folks online?
Well, I don't have any means to, so I don't know if we have any means to know for the people online to ask questions. I know there were a lot of people.
I'll ask Jeff a question in the meantime.
Yeah,
if that's
please,
okay.
Danielle.
Jeffrey.
So, earlier, Jeffrey, you talked about your, kind of work on economic security arrangements. And one thing, I guess, that, Canadians, I think, in this moment, we're wondering about the USMCA. We haven't really talked about, or the CUSMA. We haven't really talked about that yet on the panel. But presumably the tariffs, the tariff threats, and the sort of this is looming, this question of what is going to happen there. We call it we're going to we're going to review it. You might be talking about a renegotiation. And Kim, the question for you too, like what does that look like? What would be on the table from the American perspective? What should we as Canadians be prepared for? Is that okay that I asked the question,
Thank you,
Jeff? Sorry.
That's great.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a first stab at that, but I'm curious Kim's thoughts as well. I know, so I do think, well, maybe starting point, come back to this question, sort of what are the motivations for tariffs? In my, again, personal view, I definitely think one of the motivations is sort of resetting and rebalancing leverage in advance of kind of a bigger discussion about USMCA and the future of USMCA. That sort of, this is a way to get leverage to kind of push forward U.S. interest on USMCA. Again, I think there's a sort of technical question. Obviously, there's a review built into USMCA, and I sort of understand many people in this country are thinking about it in terms of sort of that review mechanism. My sense of where the debate is in the U.S. right now is that the Trump administration is signaling pretty clearly they're looking for, what I would call a renegotiation in terms of sort of opening actual text and wanting to say, not just we're sort of doing a review kind of checkboxing, but actually we are sort of looking for, big substantive changes for what is in the agreement. What actually the U.S. asks will be in that negotiation, I don't know. I suspect there will be a reopening of discussion on rules of origin in autos and thinking through that. I know there are a bunch of specific issues tied with Mexico, particularly tied to sort of Chinese investment in Mexico, both in the auto sector and more generally. Again, as I mentioned, I think there's a lot of logic to bring in a set of sort of framework for economic security cooperation into the context of a binding trade agreement like USMCA. So bringing in things like cooperation on investment security, both inbound and outbound, bringing in things like, our approach towards connected vehicles and the national security risks in connected vehicles. Those are things that I think can be baked into a trade agreement, which is not what we've traditionally done in trade agreements, but which I think is where kind of the sort of political debate is moving, and where, certainly on the U.S. side, I think that's where kind of a lot of big U.S. interests lie today, sort of not in the more kind of traditional trade agreement aspects. It's on these sort of core economic security issues. So I think there's a lot of logic to bringing that into USMCA. Again, I won't predict where exactly the negotiations would go, but I suspect, again, in sort of certainly with the sort of U.S.-Mexico dynamic, they'll be able to bring those in.
Challenge with the upcoming review, which will also be a part of negotiation, is just the value of an agreement that can be, willy-nilly undermined, right, with these kinds of threats, because the 25% tariff is just, that just destroys any of the market access provisions. So, there is a notion in, I think Latin is pacta sunt servanda, promises must be kept. Whew. I don't know where that fits in with a future agreement. And that's why it's right, this economic security thing, we're dealing with real challenges that have percolated up as the global economy has changed, the structure of it. But we got to be careful to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But these kinds of actions do a lot to undermine that system.
Very true. Kim,
Well, actually, could I ask a counter question?
is that your way of not answering Danielle's question?
No. I mean, because I echoed Jeffrey's points in response to Danielle's question. I think that there's an opportunity, if we're going to be renegotiating USMCA at an earlier rate than expected, to really incorporate some of the more national security related issues of investment screening in particular, just recognizing that there is still and continuing concern on all sides about Chinese investment. But my other question, I'm just wondering, because to Jeff's point, if we can throw agreements out kind of willy-nilly, I'm wondering, does that give Canada any upper hand in negotiating another agreement?
I mean, I think really, again, we're in a unfortunate, we're just a much smaller player, and if it were up to Canada, we would not touch the agreement. I mean, so there's two issues. There's the legitimacy of the agreement, if it can be, thrown out, and 25% tariffs thrown on everything, on a weekend, right? So there's that question, and then there's the other issue is that, you guys keep, we were having this discussion earlier where the Canadians were saying, let's, the review of the CUSMA, and the Americans were saying the renegotiation of the CUSMA, and we don't want to open that thing up if we don't,
Traumatized.
Yeah, we didn't want to open it up. We didn't want to, switch it from NAFTA to the USMCA. We didn't want to, originally we didn't even want to shift from the Canada-U.S. free trade agreement to the NAFTA, right? Like, so there's we want to protect we want to protect the access we have, and I don't think there's any desire to. I think the big question for us is really, is this a legitimate agreement? Can we count on it? Can we count on free access and certain access to the U.S. market? That's really the question. Or do we have to start thinking really differently from the Canadian perspective? Did you want to add to that?
If I can just say, it certainly sounds like now it's conditional in a way, right? That access is not guaranteed. It's conditional and it's transactional. It's kind of we have to give or at least adapt, and it's not just, oh, here it is, and we're good for the next 20 years. That certainly doesn't apply anymore, at least from my perspective.
Get free trade agreements, not even managed trade. It's conditional trade.
Conditional trade.
I think you're absolutely right, Danielle. We're still going to want to have that agreement, even if it's maybe the paper it's worth on, or it's written on is not as worth as much as it used to be, type thing. But I think there is, of course, and a lot of this isn't necessarily my own opinion. There's a lot of people have been echoing this, that there is actually an opportunity here to wake us up, to get that political will to overcome some of the tough decisions federally and provincially, to make this, our national economy stronger together. And that means, yes, dealing with internal trade barriers and trying to improve the internal market. It's absolutely critical that we get the trade enabling infrastructure to make us recover that identity as a trading nation, so we can trade to the rest of the world, because the only way we're going to ever have real leverage with the United States is if we can say, you don't want to buy it? Fine. We've got a lot of other customers that can take access of the products. Right now it's an empty threat, but with these types of actions, there are unintended consequences. Yes, there's a paucity of options that Canada has right now. We're cornered, but that doesn't have to be that way. And this will hopefully light a candle under our leaders' butts to be able to make those tough decisions, invest the dollars, and work as a society to find a grander bargain to give us that leverage, and ultimately improve our not only our national security, our independence as our foreign policy independence, and the long-term economic competitiveness that we need.
I hope it's going to be more than a candle, like a torch. Wolfgang, you said that there was a question online.
Just one question relating to CETA, the Canada-EU free trade agreement. To what extent that is an alternative to the relationship with the U.S.?
Anyone wants to take that on?
You go first, I'll jump right in.
I mean, I think that there's no question that, our relationship with the United States is much more significant and important. We have an ocean between us. My understanding, I think certainly that is, when we think about, I think companies now are probably all thinking, do they have a potential opportunity to trade in Europe? Europe is not the only place with which Canada has a free trade agreement. We have the CPTPP, we have the Canada-Indonesia agreement, we're negotiating one with the ASEAN countries. There's other possibilities, fast growth economies in other parts of the world. Europe is not such a fast growth economy, but still an important market. So these are all important markets and important opportunities, but they're not going to, certainly in the short term, not going to replace what we have with the Americans, and they just don't replace our geographic location. But I do think that if we think about also services and digital economy type activities, we can think more about what is possible in other parts of the world. I think to a greater extent than maybe we could, 20, 30 years ago. Now that is, those are new opportunities that do exist for us. But I also do understand from talking, and I don't know if there's anybody here from Global Affairs in the room who wants to speak about this, but I do understand that actually a lot of those, with CETA in particular, that they're actually underutilized. Like, people will still Is that correct? From your former time at Global Affairs, that people are not even electing to export via the CETA rules. They will use most favored nation as opposed, like they'll use the WTO rules as opposed to the CETA rules. So I think there's an issue of also like lack of exposure or literacy, or maybe just not worth it. I don't know what.
That I'm glad you brought that in, because what I was going to say is if the last issue is about getting our political leaders' butts moving, at the end of the day, you know, there's only so far that government can take things, and economic activity is ultimately carried through by businesses. So the highway has been built. We need the businesses to drive on it. So the call also has to be for industry to take some leadership once that market access has been developed. But it leads back to infrastructure, but now it's a second order infrastructure question, which is so that the companies in Canada has their own factories, their own equipment, particularly if we're talking about goods, to be able to produce that meet the tastes and standards of the European market, because it's different. I talked to fisheries out in Atlantic Canada, and talked about a lot of their fish is export directly to the United States because they're processing it to meet the needs and requirements of the U.S. market. So businesses should be doing some more missions, you know, whether it's, you know, through the government or on their own, to explore what it needs to take to access that market and then make better use of the agreement itself.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
I would just add that, you know, Canada, like trade diversification has been kind of a goal for many generations, and we've not been that successful at doing so. I mean, we have been somewhat more successful in recent memory in diversifying to, you know, in expanding our trade with other markets, but we've never had a shock like this. And so one would think that in every business, every Canadian business, this over the past, you know, number of weeks and months, in particular this last, you know, 72 hours, there have been these kind of, you know, questions around, okay, you know, what are our other options here? Can we, you know, what are our options in the short term? What are our options in the medium term? And how do we rethink our strategy? And so I think that these conversations around, you know, what are the other markets that are available to us if we can no longer count on this, and we have to figure out, you know, we have to figure out how to kind of diversify our trade. So we might see changes that we've never seen before.
We're pretty much done, but I'd like to give the last words to our American friends on the panel. So any thoughts going forward for the Canada-U.S. relation?
So again, first of all, thank you so much for hosting this. It's really a very timely and relevant conversation. No, I think that, you know, I was happy to see that there was diplomatic engagement this afternoon, and so hopefully those conversations will continue. I think that, you know, to my fellow panelists' points, I mean, there's some trust that needs to be rebuilt. But I'm hoping that, you know, we do have such strong relationships between the United States and Canada that we will get there, and we will figure out what a better cooperation looks like to ensure both of our economic security as well as our national securities.
Kim, Jeffrey, last words.
Yeah, I think Kim put it very well, that the sort of, you know, I think for better or worse, the Canada and U.S. are a little bit stuck with each other, right? And I think we are going to have to find a way to live with one another. Again, looking at this from sort of the U.S. point of view and the sort of, you know, events of the last 3 days or whatever, I do think this question of, you know, how far can the U.S. go acting erratically and still be if not a preferred trade partner, at least an acceptable trade partner to our like-minded partners and allies. And I think you know, this question, which I think Daniel raises, sort of like, is this time different? Because I will say I was sort of looking up some data for a related question. And, you know, so back in 2018, we had a slightly similar series of events of sort of threats of pulling out of NAFTA and kind of canceling it, and sort of the Section 232 tariffs and sort of citing Canada as national security risks. And sorry, there's a sort of movement in Canada to say, you know, we need a Minister of Trade Diversification. We're going to sort of set all these ambitious goals to diversify exports. And I was looking at the data, and at the time in 2018, I think it was 75% of exports went to the United States. 7 years later, it is now 77% of exports that go to the United States. So I think, you know, there's that old, I think that shows sort of, again, from the Canadian side, I would be asking yourself sort of like, what happened with that strategy and what should we do differently? You know, from the U.S. side, I think, I forget what the name of the author, but the sort of, you know, statement of there's sort of so much ruin in a country, right? There's sort of like, there's a lot of things that the United States can do, and countries will still sort of gravitate towards the United States as a preferred partner in a lot of things. I think we are frankly very lucky as Americans that the fact that sort of the Chinese have done a lot of things to not make themselves a preferred partner to Canadians and to many other countries around the world. And that there are still a lot of countries that will sort of look to the United States for leadership kind of despite everything else. But certainly as an American, what I'm asking is sort of like, how far can we go down that road? I think that's the sort of long-term existential question that we're grappling with.
All right, well, stay tuned. All right, I'd like to thank our panelists for, I think, what has been an amazing discussion. I think we covered a lot of ground. We didn't resolve everything, but I think there is cause for optimism, for hope. So let's build on that. And thank you for people being here in spite of the not so good weather, although pretty usual for this time of the year in Ottawa. And for our people online, again, we apologize for the wait, but we had to get the people up the elevators into the room. So everyone, thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. Great. And I'm sure we'll have many other conversations like these over the next few years. Hopefully not too many. Hopefully not too many.